Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum dear students. I hope you are all doing well. Welcome to University of Education, Department of English. I am Najmul Hassan. Our course title is 19th Century English Novel, program BS English. Students, in today's lecture, we will discuss a question of Jane Austen's novel Emma. And the question is, discussion on why do you suppose Miss Austen once said, a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. Is a liking of subject matter necessary for proper appreciation of a work of art? Is something else equally more important? Students, as you know, Jane Austen occupies a high rank among English novelists. She is a good realist who draws her materials from actual life as she sees it. Principal theme of her novels is marriage. She is preoccupied with the business of making matches of her heroines. She gives us, when we talk about her character portrayal, she gives us an abundance of character portraits. She shows an acute grasp of the human mind and human motives and reveals these with great skills. She is not only concerned with the external of the character, but also with the psychological portrayal of it. Her studies of women are more successful than those of men. Students, when we talk about her novel Emma, it is based on the lives of very few characters, and she uses conversations, unique dialogues, and patterns of speech to give insight into each character. She beautifully describes the character of Emma, who is the protagonist of novel Emma. Readers indeed like the heroine of the novel, which according to Jane Austen, she says no one but myself will much like. But many readers indeed like the character of Emma. Emma. When we talk about the character of Emma, she is the protagonist of novel. 20 years old, handsome, clever and rich, but unsure about marriage, naturally assertive. She has been described in the chapter 1 of volume 1 of the text as Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. She was the youngest of the two daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess, who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. 16 years had Miss Taylor been in the Mr. Woodhouse family, less as a governess than a friend. Very fond of both daughters, but particularly of Emma. Between them, it was more the intimacy of sisters. Even before Miss Taylor had ceased to hold the nominal office of governess, The mildness of her temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint, and the shadow of authority being now long passed away, they had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. After reading these lines, you can say that the writer of novel Emma, Jane Austen, is going to introduce a lively and powerful girl, someone worthy of admiration or envy. The reader wants to root for such a gifted heroine, but at the same time is put off by the egotism in the narrator's ironic tone. The reader may be sure that this paragon of female virtue will be taken down a peg or two before the story ends. Students, when we talk about the novel is narrated using free indirect discourse, which means that although the all-knowing narrator speaks in the third person, she often related things from Emma's point of view and describes things in language which we might imagine Emma is using. For the novel, when we talk about Jane Austen's statement, Jane Austen took a heroine whom, according to her, no one but myself will much like. Many readers have indeed not liked the heroine of this novel, as I already told you, but many liked her and like her character. Emma's flaws in the beginning of novel. Students, when we talk about Emma's flaws in the beginning of novel, in the beginning, as we all know, after reading text of Emma, a multi-dimensional character. She is spoiled and conceited. She possesses the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. Emma's stubbornness and vanity produce many of the novel's conflicts as Emma struggles to develop emotionally. As we see in the lines of text, doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgments, but directed chiefly by her own. The real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. Students, these kinds of things, you may say, these lines show that how these kinds of things affect her in the future and how it created problem for her. Even soon prove her to be willful, snobbish, and at times unfeeling. Until the end of the incident at Box Hill, which is the emotional climax of the book and the beginning of her generation. She has been guilty of much that is reprehensible in both thought and deed. Students, when we talk about Emma's three major mistakes, she has done three major mistakes in the novel. The first mistake which she has done is that she has induced her friend Harriet Smith to refuse marriage proposal of a farmer of Hartfield, Robert Martin, because his status was not high. She directed Harriet's focus towards Mr. Elton. She has allowed Harriet only 14 minutes for a visit to Robert Martin's mother and sisters, whom Harriet had visited for 6 weeks in the preceding summer. So after hearing this, you can say that Harriet Smith, who was her friend, was fully dependent on the character of Emma. When we talk about her second mistake, she takes interest in Frank Churchill, although she does not care about him. On top, she does not realize that rather than being committed to stay single, as she always claims, she is in love with Mr. Knightley. Emma has been patronizing towards the Coles as well. Another blunder when we talk about her mistakes, another blunder she makes, we can see in chapter 15 of volume 2, her behavior with Miss Bates. Her behavior with Miss Bates too at a picnic was not very good. She shows her stubbornness and faults in the beginning of novel. Later on, Mr. Knightley scolds her for treating Miss Bates so rudely. And after that, we can see in the lines her behavior, her reflection. She was vexed beyond that, beyond what could have been expressed, almost beyond what she could conceal. Never had she felt so agitated, so mortified, grieved at any circumstance in her life. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of his representation, there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? How could she have exposed herself to such ill opinion in any one she valued? And how suffer him to leave her without saying one word of gratitude, of concurrence, of common kindness? Students, these lines mark this point that Emma realized cruelty of her behavior. These lines mark the point at which Emma's growing self-understanding, which helps her feel how wrongly she has treated Miss Bates, coincides with her growing attachment to Mr. Knightley as well. First reaction of reader about Emma's character. In the opening chapter of the novel, as we already have read the opening lines of the text, we are informed of the evils of Emma's situation. The real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. These evils are the power of having too much her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. Now students, these lines which I have read foreshadow the novel structure as a whole. What Emma fails to perceive, that is possible to have too much of one's own way or to be too satisfied with oneself, is exactly what she learns over the course of the book. She is permitted too much influence over Harriet and comes to understand that this power threatens not only Harriet's happiness but also her own. In other words, you can say Emma has too much authority in her father's household, and what is alarming, she has too high an opinion of her ability and her judgment. Her complacency, self-complacency also clearly appears in the very first chapter of the novel, which shows her dominance, her authoritative nature, and her self-complacency. To make a match for Mr. Elton. After having claimed the credit for having brought about the match between Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston, she says with full of confidence that she still has to make one more match for Mr. Elton. Text. Only one more, Papa. Only one. Only for Mr. Elton. Poor Mr. Elton. You like Mr. Elton. I must look about for a wife for him as well. There is nobody in the Highbury who deserves him. Student, Mr. Knightley was also sitting over there, a sensible man, who you may say a true counselor of Emma. He says, a man of 6 or 7 and 20 can take care of himself. Don't take interest in him. I hear you can say Mr. Knightley in fact was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. These lines shows he never shows any hesitation to tell her the truth of her flaws, about her demerits. Next comes when we talk about her decision about matchmaking between Mr. Elton and Harriet Smith. Mr. Knightley expresses to her his view that Mr. Elton is a worldly person who will not marry a girl without a dowry and with a doubtful parentage. But still she directs all her energies and fully tries for making a match between Mr. Elton and Harriet Smith. She cannot perceive that Mr. Elton is interested in herself. She misunderstands all of Mr. Elton's attentions to herself, thinking that he is trying to please her only for Harriet, her friend. She could not able to recognize his true motive. She did not care about her brother-in-law's observation that Mr. Elton seems to be in love with herself. As we can see in the text of the line, as we can see in the text that the first error and the worst lay at her door. It was foolish, it was wrong to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was adventuring too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be serious, a trick of what ought to be simple. She was quite concerned and ashamed and resolved to do such things no more. Students, these are Emma's reflection when she got to know that Mr. Elton was not interested in Harriet Smith, but he was interested in herself, in her. These are the Emma's reflection when Mr. Elton proposes her instead of proposing Harriet Smith. It reveals to her that she was wrong in her thinking. Though Emma is never totally cured of her impulse to make matches for others, here she diagnoses what is wrong with her matchmaking. Here, I will talk about Mr. Knightley thinking. Mr. Knightley gives readers a clue in her judgment. He says in her judgment, she is being guided by fancy and whim. He says to Mr. Weston in a conversation, Emma allows her fancy to have the better of her understanding. Later, I will also discuss Jane Austen's her self-opinion. Jane Austen also describes Emma as an Imaginist. She received a big shock from Mr. Elton when he proposed her instead of Harriet. This development comes as a big blow to Emma's complacency. There was a moment of her self-analysis. There was a moment of her mental enlightenment. And you may say, she realized her error of judgment. Next comes her resolve after the failure of her plan about her friend Harriet. Some readers show sympathy after Emma's realization about her mistake, which she have done as far as Mr. Elton and Harriet Smith's life is concerned. She feels quite concerned and ashamed to do. She tries to resolve such things. Emma's resolution gives rise to a feeling of hope in the mind of reader. Her mistake in the matter of Frank Churchill. Students, soon she forgets her resolve and goes on to make another major mistake. Emma makes a very high opinion about Frank without having met him, as she already made an opinion about Mr. Elton and was interested in his life, in his matchmaking. She does not realize that she is hasty in having formed a favorable opinion. While Mr. Knightley, as far as when we talk about Mr. Knightley does not form any sort of opinion about Frank and just waiting to see what sort of man Frank is. Firstly, Emma takes interest in Frank, flirts with him. Then she starts thinking about the possibility of marriage between Frank and her friend Harriet. But later on, she once again receives a shock when she learns that Frank has long been secretly engaged to Jane Fairfax, niece of Miss Bates. Frank's attention towards Emma had merely been a mask to hide his secret engagement with Jane Fairfax. When we talk about the response of Emma after hearing the secret engagement of Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill, she says, I may have lost my heart, but not my self-control. After discovering that Frank Churchill has been secretly engaged to Jane Fairfax, while blatantly flirting with Emma, Emma smiles, brushes herself off, and maintains as much dignity and self-composure as she can. Her full realization about her faults. Harriet reveals that she has been in love with Mr. Knightley ever since the evening he had asked her to dance with him. Emma surprised. She feels jealousy. In response, when we talk about Emma's response, after hearing the statement of Harriet Smith that she has been in love with Mr. Knightley, she is surprised. And you can see in the lines of the text, Emma's eyes were instantly withdrawn, and she sat silently meditating in a fixed attitude for a few minutes. A few minutes were sufficient for making her acquainted with her own heart. A mind like hers, once opening to suspicion, made rapid progress. She touched, she admitted, she acknowledged the whole truth. Why was it so much worse that Harriet should be in love with Mr. Knightley than with Frank Churchill? Why was the evil so dreadfully increased by Harriet's having some hope of return? It darted through her with the speed of an arrow that Mr. Knightley must marry no one but herself. So students, the midst of Emma's conversation with Harriet, in which Harriet confesses her feelings for Mr. Knightley, Emma's suspicions and her attention have been misdirected, focusing on Harriet's possible matches and on her speculations about Jane. Her ability to see beyond appearance are finally directed appropriately after her realization that Frank and Jane are engaged. She makes a swift leap forward in her own self-understanding. Emma does not come to this realization that she loves Mr. Knightley. Only her jealousy after knowing about Harriet's feelings about Mr. Knightley brings her there. Her relationship with Mr. Knightley takes shape only, you may say, in the context of surrounding web of social relationships. She discovers that she herself actually has been unconsciously, you may say, in love with Mr. Knightley. She realizes her own prolonged blindness to the realities she had proved to be sadly mistaken in all her plans and efforts. Every moment in her life had brought a fresh surprise, and every surprise has been a matter of humiliation to her. She asks herself how to understand all this. She is really perplexed and confused at this stage. One thing absolutely clear in her mind, and that is her love for Mr. Knightley, who must not be allowed to marry Harriet. If at all Mr. Knightley has any thought of marrying that girl, she has landed herself, and because of her complete realization of her errors. Next comes change in her character. You may say improvement of her character. Emma's character, when we talk about Emma's character, improvement of Emma's character, her way of thinking and outlook have been changed. Emma shows her capacity to learn from experiences In the beginning, she faces circumstances and many ups and downs which lead to many complications in her own life and in the life of others. She has been unjust to Mr. Robert Martin, Miss Bates, and Jane Fairfax. She has been unjust to Mr. Robert Martin in the matter of her friend Harriet Smith. And Miss Bates acts, you know better about the incident of picnic. But after all this, she corrects herself, shows a capacity and readiness to reform her character, which actually you can say improvement of her character. Ashamed of what she has done, she visits Miss Bates' house to apologize for her behavior at Box Hill picnic. Sincerely repents of her bad manners through which she treated her and adopts friendly attitude towards her. Now she feels happy as well for both Harriet and Robert Martin. Her love for family. When we talk about Emma, love for her family, there are many other qualities in Emma which increase her attractiveness in the mind of a reader. Very devoted to her father and always tries to make him happy. As we see in chapter 3 of volume 1, she always happy because of her father. When Mrs. Bates, Miss Bates and Mrs. Goddard visit her house, she warmly welcomed them because of her father's sake. They are found to be most agreeable by Mr. Woodhouse, who is himself full of trivial communications. She would not even like to marry if marriage means forsaking her father. At one point, she says, Never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first, and always right in any man's eyes, as I am in my father's. She is spoiled, you can say, but her love for her father have no boundary. She devotes herself to his care and is rewarded with highest regard, and until she recognizes a deeper love in Mr. Knightley, she need be content with nothing else. No one can love us more than our parents do with all of her, though with all of our faults. Her love for Miss Taylor is also unforgettable, and love which Miss Taylor feels for Emma is a proof that there is something attractive in her character. Nobility of her character. Mr. Knightley always tries to correct Emma on her mistakes. And you know very well that Mr. Knightley is a good observer, is a good analyst. Emma on her mistake, his continuing love for Emma therefore clearly shows that there is nothing fundamentally wrong with Emma. When Mr. Knightley, a sensible man, declares his love for Emma, Emma has become a greatly reformed person. Here I will say a quote of the text. If I loved you less, I might be able to talk about it more, Mr. Knightley. He is a sensible man, not altogether unlike Mr. Darcy, who is character of Jane Austen's novel Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Knightley is a man of actions, not words. When it comes to expressing love, we can see how tenderly he loves Emma and holds her in high regard. Always tries to correct Emma and acts as a counselor of her. Secret of her charm. Students, when we talk about secret of Emma, of her charm, her secret of charm lies in her capacity for self-examination, self-analysis, her capacity for reforms and self-improvement. She does not try to defend herself against herself. Add to all the characteristics the fact that she is clever and rich, and we have a heroine whom no one, only the author liked, whom not only the author liked, but we like also. Emma also, you know that she has a feministic approach in her novels, and marriage was major theme of her novels. And you can put these things on Emma's character as well. She actually tries to her thinking, to her approach on Emma's character as well. Emma in terms of its subject matter. In terms of its subject matter, Emma was by no means revolutionary. Austen herself described the novel's subject, 3 or 5 families in a country village, as an ideal subject of any novel. And you know that subject matter of a piece of art is basically the focus of the art. And in this novel, the focus of art is Emma's character. And in terms of its subject matter, Emma was by no means revolutionary. When we talk about literary appreciation is simply that learning to appreciate, respect and enjoy literature. Many readers have indeed not liked the heroine of this character, this novel. But we can also see that many articles and reviews in which Emma has been praised. But just this is not matter. I mean, just literary appreciation or character liking or disliking is not matter. It is not important that liking of a subject matter is just necessary for proper appreciation of a work of art. Art of characterization, storytelling, settings, forms, techniques, events related with experiences are also important for the appreciation of a work of art. We can say we are not only going to analyze Emma's character, rather for literary appreciation of a text. The critic requires analysis of how an author uses forms, structures, and techniques to create meaning in combination with well-reasoned and soundly supported personal opinions in relation to literary work. And Jane Austen did this in a very impressive way. You can see references as well. And students, that's all for today's lecture. God bless you all. Allah Hafiz.